In this section of the lecture, I'm going to talk about costs or what we might think of as limits to economic development. And I could have included this in the first section of this lecture, but it's an important point, and so I wanted to break it out into a separate section to give it some emphasis. As late as the end of the 18th century, there were two views of history. One view was that history was a closed system, if you like. There was a fixed stock of human character types, events, social movements, and so on that cycled from age to age or repeated in various ways from age to age. At around the same time, the idea, an alternative idea, was coming to prominence. And here I've chosen Condorcet as one, a quote from Condorcet as one example of that view. Condorcet, in his writing Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind, wrote, "From observation of the progress which science and civilization have hitherto made, the advantages that must result from this state of improvement can have no limit but the absolute perfection of the human species." So you've got two very different views here. One view is that basically history repeats forever. There's no idea of progress. Our knowledge is going to stay the same. Types of people we are going to stay the same. The types of events that occur are going to stay the same. And here's a second view which says, no. In fact, we're on a path to perfection. That we've started out on this path which is steadily going to take us from where we are now through to some state of permanent bliss or perfection for the human species. And so I think it's really important to think about this issue of what we do think about the nature of history with, for example, these views of closed system and continuous improvement as being two perspectives that are sort of opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of what we think about the nature of history, the nature of progress and development. The perspective that I'm going to take is to ask whether perhaps the truth doesn't lie in between. That on the one hand, I think that the study of the history of economic development, which we've been doing in this course, does show that in parts of the world there have been very significant improvements in material well-being and living standards in the past 250 years. So the idea that there is never progress, that history is this static state, it might have seemed plausible in the Malthusian era, but to claim that there is no progress seems completely implausible in the period of the last 250 years. So it seems important to acknowledge that there has been progress. On the other hand, saying that there's progress doesn't mean that we have to accept Condorcet's view, for example, that we're setting out on a path to human perfection. That we have to beware of being too triumphalist about the improvements in material well-being and living standards that have occurred in the past 250 years. And so I just thought it was important to note the ways in which we might have some doubts about being on the path of permanent progress or the path to perfection. And so in effect saying that, well, look, there has been some progress, but we can't necessarily think of this being some unlimited path that we're on. Or in terms of my heading on this slide, that probably the truth lies somewhere between. In particular, what we've seen in the course is that not all parts of the world have shared in this improvement in living standards. So that's the phenomenon of the great divergence. So while it's certainly true to say that economically some parts of the world have seen big improvements in material well-being, there's still other parts of the world that in relative terms have seen very little improvement over that period. Secondly, that some parts of the world have lower living standards today, partly because of the development of other parts of the world. So it's not just the case that, well, look, there are some parts of the world that through the progress they've made are better off, and there are other parts that haven't. But look, we think that in time, the countries that haven't developed, they will develop and catch up and share the same progress. It's also important to note, as I'm making the point with this dot point, that's the last dot point on the slide at the moment, that there have been interdependencies between different countries in the world. And so the progress in some parts of the world has, to some degree, been on the back of lower living standards of other parts of the world. And so we've talked, for example, in the lecture on Africa about the existence of slavery, the long-lasting effects that's had on economic development in the regions of Africa where slavery took place. And we've talked about resource expropriation, for example, both in Latin America and Africa, where the European nations that had colonised Latin America and Africa basically expropriated resources from there, took ownership of those resources, which would have otherwise been owned by the indigenous populations in those countries. So it's directly lowered the well-being of the populations in those parts of the world, reduced the scope for them to improve their well-being in the future. So when we talk about there being this path of progress, when we realise that in fact that's only been some parts of the world, it's also important to realise that the parts of the world, the benefit that's come to some parts of the world from that progress has actually has involved imposing costs on other parts of the world. So we have to be careful sort of using the word progress or thinking in terms of this path to perfection, because the path to progress in the parts of the world where there's been progress has been associated with actually other parts of the world having lower living standards. Thirdly, even in the parts of the world which have seen this progress and improvement in living standards, even there have been costs of economic development. So at various times the battle for resources that can be used in production between countries which would have been considered to be in the developed world at the time, for example, in World War II, that imposed very significant costs on people in those countries that happened to be living at that time and were therefore drawn in to that activity of warfare. So here we're making a similar point to the second last dot point, but about a different population. That the last dot point was the idea that, look, the progress that's happened in some parts of the world has caused a reduction in well-being for people in other parts of the world. Here we're saying that the progress that's occurred in some parts of the world has actually at various times imposed very substantial costs on the populations in those developed parts of the world. Or if we think about environmental costs, so for example in the lecture where we had a couple of sections on the rise of the US, we talked about the Dust Bowl, we talked about the extinction of the bison. More generally, we know that there are all sorts of environmental problems being created through economic development, reduced quality of natural resources such as water quality, reduced air quality. And we know that those are problems that are going to have to be solved in the future. So in effect, what's happening is populations in the developed world today are creating problems which are going to have to be paid for, or which are lowering the well-being of populations who are going to live in the future in that developed world. So my perspective on this question of progress is that the truth really lies between. On the one hand, it's important to acknowledge the improvements in material well-being and living standards that have occurred in some parts of the world in the past 250 years, and important to acknowledge that that has had a major effect on human well-being. But to see that as an unambiguously positive experience for all parts of the world and for everyone in the world would also be to get things very wrong in terms of thinking about progress. That not all parts of the world have shared in this improvement. In fact, some parts of the world have been made worse off because of the improvement. And even in the regions where the improvement has taken place, there are populations at particular times who have been disadvantaged by that experience of economic development. One way an economist might think of this is in terms of the criteria they think of that are known as efficiency versus equity. And so to an economist, on the one hand, the experience of history tells us that economic development isn't a zero-sum game. That we can't understand history just as an experience where there's this fixed amount of resources and different countries are fighting in some way for those resources. That the development of new technology, the introduction of greater scope for trade and international trade has really meant that the size of the amount that's available to be consumed by human population around the world, the amount per capita that's available to be consumed, has increased. So there's been an improvement in what we'd call efficiency. You can't understand history just as an experience of different countries battling for this fixed amount of resources that are available to consume. That in fact, the amount we have available to consume has increased over time. So there's been an improvement in efficiency. But equally, it would be wrong to think just of the history, just to think of history as an experience where the only thing that we think is relevant is that efficiency improved. The only thing that we think is relevant is that there's a bigger total amount of resources for everyone to consume. Because clearly, for understanding historical experience, distributional concerns also matter for understanding the experience of global economic development. That we have to understand that there are some countries that have been made worse off because of the experience of other countries being made better off. We have to understand that particular points in time, trying to become a more developed economy has meant that some countries in the world, for example, have gone to war with each other to battle for resources that can be used in economic production. So again, I guess what I'm saying is we need a balanced perspective. We need the idea that the truth lies in between. That on the one hand, history has been more than a history of distribution, that it's also been about improvements in efficiency, an expansion of the total amount of resources available to consume. But on the other hand, it's not as simple as thinking that, well, look, we've had development, the total amount of resources available to consume have gone up, so everyone's better off. In fact, distributional concerns have also been very much a part of the story.